Martin, it's really a pleasure to welcome you, and thank you for kicking us off with your talk tonight.
Well, thank you very, very much for that lovely introduction. I hope that didn't put you to sleep, and I hope I can kind of keep everybody awake with the story of decolonization and this question, really, did it remake the world? That's my topic for the evening, and I suppose in order to answer it, I think that perhaps we need to think about decolonization itself, what it means, what it actually achieved, and more crucially, perhaps, what it didn't achieve. And in order to answer, or in order at least to raise those questions, I'm going to have 5 themes to tonight's lecture. And there they are. Meanings, a global decolonization, if you like, something that I consider to be essential in understanding what's going on, just as essential as putting my glasses on. The question of violence and where it sits in decolonization, and linked to that, I suppose, the idea of moral disarmament, something I'll explain a little bit more as we proceed. And then moving on, as decolonization as a process kind of hots up in the 1960s and beyond, is there a big shift? Is there something more radical, a kind of third worldism, as it's sometimes called, a new idea of world making, as the specialists sometimes call it? That's what I'll discuss. Fourthly, and then finally, fifthly, something that I think is in a way a very curious absence from studies of decolonization, and that's the partnership and the relationship between decolonization and globalization. Because in many respects, as you'll see, I'll be arguing that actually I think it's that interaction that is as important, if not more important, than all of those other things put together. So, first then, a word on the nature of decolonization itself. Well, the numbers seem to speak for themselves. In the 200 years from the American Revolution of 1776, over 160 dependent territories either achieved sovereign independence or were assimilated into larger states and confederations. The reversal of this process, the disintegration of European overseas empires and their replacement by a multiplicity of sovereign nation states, is handily described as decolonization. And 2 very prominent German scholars have suggested that decolonization might even be conceptualized as, quote, an apparatus for the serial production of sovereignty. Well, arguments continue about how real such sovereign independence actually is, and I think rightly so. Identifying decolonization with a shift from rule by foreigners to government by locals is analytically limiting. Its antecedent, colonization, left imprints in patterns of inequality, in degraded environments, and in systems of belief that couldn't be undone by a simple handover of political power. What some have called uncolonizing is more gradual. It's impossible, I think, to map onto neat timelines of imperial departure. And of course, for indigenous peoples of the Fourth World, as it's now called in particular, claims to decolonization remain very substantially unrealized. If we look at this German poster for a moment, still in German, I'm not a German speaker, but it's basically saying, it's produced in 1919, what would happen if the Entente powers, the victors of the First World War, got serious about self-determination, the sort of catchword of the time of the Paris Peace Conference, and let go of their colonial reigns. And you can see there the sheer extent of persistent colonialism even after a First World War had supposedly shaken to the foundations modern imperialism. Well, that German poster is raising something very, very important, I think. Self-determination, whatever it might mean, and it's a term I'll come back to in a moment, clearly had not been realized for most of what we would now call the global south as a result of this first 20th century attempt at world making, the First World War peace settlements of the Paris Treaty system. Okay then, no early 20th century decolonization. But still, shouldn't we come back to those numbers that I started with? From a global perspective, the direction of historical travel surely looks pretty clear towards a decolonization destination signposted by empire disintegration and the proliferation of nation states. Think for a moment, telescoping forward 25 years, to the foundation of the United Nations in July of 1945. Well, at its foundation, the UN boasted a membership, and it did boast, quite rightly, I think, in many respects, it boasted a membership of 51 states. Numbers climbed steadily after that, although much more slowly from the 1980s onward, and they peaked in 2011 with the admission of South Sudan at 193. So, in other words, surely you don't need me to rattle on for another 30 minutes or so, because decolonization is fundamentally the story of the triumph of one after another nation state across the global south. Well, does that make sense? I'm not sure that it does. I'll explain that image in just a moment, but in the broadest geopolitical terms, 20th century empires, of which this is expressed in opposition to one, 20th century empires were pretty much of two types. One were the so-called land-based empires, Imperial Russia, King China, Ottoman Turkey, or the Habsburg Empire. And broadly speaking, they all demonstrated a system in which a central authority, often configured around a dominant ethnic group, extended its dominion over contiguous territories to rule a single geographically connected empire, hence the land empires title. Well, as that previous image produced in Weimar Germany described, many of those land-based empires would collapse with the First World War, with the first global conflict of the 20th century. But what didn't collapse were the other forms of empire, and those, of course, are often described as the Oceanic empires. A metropolitan power with some sort of naval capacity, occupied, claimed, and then administered disparate territories spread over multiple continents. Well, as you all know, the British and French empires were the largest latter-day examples of these, but their Portuguese and Dutch cousins, although smaller, were older. And while the modern iteration of Oceanic empire was European in origin, tightly bound, of course, to histories of slaving, by the 1900s, other states, most notably Japan and the United States, were building Oceanic empires as well. It might seem logical, then, to presume that by tracking the fate of these Oceanic empires, we track decolonization as well. Well, not quite. The meaning of decolonization is contested because I think disagreement persists about its essential qualities. The word decolonization didn't have common currency before World War II, and it wasn't widely used at the height of the process it describes in the 1950s and the 1960s. Rather, decolonization was a process of several moving parts. The withdrawal of European rule, to be sure, the takeover of governmental apparatus by anti-colonial nationalists, usually, the pressures of Cold War rivalries, increasingly, and the efforts of minority groups in decolonizing states to assert their own separate claims to nationhood. Others assuredly wanted change, but didn't think decolonization the best way to get it. Mistaken they may have been, but those trying to reform empire rather than to destroy it were extremely widespread. And, of course, histories of decolonization, since we think we tend to know the outcome, tend to overlook those who were, if you like, trying to achieve change within the fabric of empire rather than against the fabric of empire. But turning to those who assuredly did want empire to end, anti-colonialism, I think, makes sense as a unifying abstraction. What does that mean? Well, an expression of opposition to something that's just ethically indefensible, rather than as unswerving support for a particular national form. And that brings me at last to this image, Angola for the Angolans. You might think, well, that is a quintessentially nationalistic, anti-colonial statement. It's actually issued in support of the MPLA, the principal Marxist revolutionary group in Angola. But if you can read the very small print here, you'll see that it's printed and distributed from Canada. It's based on a cycle of posters that were actually originated here in London in the early 1970s. And as I said, it expresses support for a movement, the MPLA, that is so substantially founded by a group of Angolan political exiles. All of which, if combined, reminds us that, well, even something that's saying, look, support an independent Angola, has a kind of global vintage, a global dimension to it. To complicate things even more, if you can stand it, in the public sphere, decolonization, I think, is now most identifiable with calls for an overhaul of public culture, from place names and statues to museum holdings and media, academic curricula, and political language. And of course, within countries like this one, implicated in empire, slavery, and their legacies of racial discrimination, public calls to decolonize are bound up with the contemporary condition of those societies. Demands for decolonization in this context turn on attitudinal change toward histories that societies, as refracted through their public institutions, their laws, their police practices, their museums, their monuments and heritage sectors, find pretty difficult to confront. All of this is to say that I think we might usefully think of decolonization as at once a political form and a cultural phenomenon more varied, more complex, and less complete than old narratives of transfers of power might suggest. So that brings me to my second theme, which is this idea of decolonization as something intrinsically global. And again, I will explain the image in just one moment. I suppose my argument begins from that kind of global standpoint. What you can see behind you is a gathering of some of the leading lights of anti-colonialism, particularly revolutionary anti-colonialism, of the early to mid-1960s. It's a photograph taken in newly independent Algeria, and it invites you, in a way, to, well, pick your favorite revolutionary. You can see in the middle there Circled is a relatively young Nelson Mandela. To his left are leading figures in that movement I just mentioned, the MPLA in Portuguese Africa, in Angola. Surrounding them are several members of the newly established Algerian Republic. You can see at the back there the first president of the Algerian Republic, number 5, Ahmed Ben Bella. It's like a sort of revolutionary world bingo, in a sense, this image. But what it does remind you is that anti-colonialists are organizing, well, to use the terminology of 21st century academics, transnationally. They're organizing across frontiers, across empires, across borders. These are the people who will lead the struggle, or claim to be leading the struggle against the persistence of empire. Great. The problem, though, if there is a problem, the problem is that most former colonial territories, Algeria, where that photograph is taken among them, in achieving independence, still asserted their right to national self-determination, commonly understood as a community's legitimate aim to govern itself. We hit problems straight away. Isn't self-determination a projection of Western thinking, born of the liberal internationalism that decolonizers opposed? What makes a community or a people into a nation, and what confers their right to self-determination? Are its precepts fairly applied within societies internally divided by ethnicity, politics, or religion, let alone by other perhaps more telling indices of gender, sexuality, or class? And does its political form require economic substance to give self-determination real meaning? Well, I suppose the answer is that I think so. That this process, decolonization or self-determination or the achievement of national independence, isn't done, is confirmed by what decolonization, I think, failed to do. The pillars of self-determination, domestic jurisdiction and territorial integrity, have been rocked to their foundations since empires supposedly decolonized. So much so that some insist we live in a new imperial age in which stronger powers violate state sovereignty at will. At the other extreme, critics of universal rights point out that their cosmopolitanism is somehow imperialistic, claiming ethical authority, for instance, for humanitarian interventionism in former colonial spaces. There's still, in other words, a kind of persistent salvation narrative of rich world, poor world. Similar reservations appear as we move from the realm of sovereignty and international law back to material concerns. As it turned out, the making or the unmaking of empire didn't in and of itself destroy patterns of unequal trade and economic domination. No matter how revolutionary the takeover of political power, colonialism was never abruptly turned off. Its after effects persisted. They registered in debt burdens, externally imposed structural adjustments, and the degradation of ecosystems despoiled by extractive industries or poisoned, mined, and deforested during colonial military operations. Another aspect of these after effects is what might be described as colonial blowback, the ways in which once colonized societies have reshaped their former imperial metropoles through migration, changing rights to citizenship, and claims to social inclusion. For all that, the gulf separating the wealthy nations of the industrial global north from the poorer nations of the global south is still evident decades after so-called formal decolonization occurred. For many in these poorer regions, life expectancy and living standards have improved since national independence. It would, though, I think, be confusing correlation with causation to conclude that decolonization ameliorated economic conditions within once dependent territories. The eclipse of colonial governance, in other words, did not transform life chances overnight. And to be fair, how could it? Decolonization did trigger big changes in political affiliation, in the expression of cultural attachments, in people's claims to rights, dignity, and respect. Sometimes, too, in the fabric of relationships and family life, the patterns of land use and work, the aspirations and opportunities around which societies cohere. But decolonization never changed that north-south geometry of global capitalism. Economically, then, I'm suggesting that processes of decolonization were less transformative economically than they were politically, culturally, or ecologically. Well, let me try and put flesh on the bones of that claim. By 1945, the architecture of the so-called Bretton Woods free trade system, which I think somebody around in a prominent position is quite opposed to at the moment, with dollar supremacy at its foundation, the prioritization of European relief after this Second World War, and the supranationalism of the United Nations, all of those things rendered the dynamics of North-South inequality more transparent. International law, which at the start of the 20th century had presupposed a racially configured world, was, after 1945, edging towards repudiation of colonialism. Now, neither the UN Charter nor the wave of human rights protections of the late 1940s, the Genocide Convention, the amendments to the Geneva Conventions, etc., none of them did that unequivocally, but they shared a common globalism, which put Europe's imperial powers on the defensive. World War II catalyzed other changes as well. Fighting total war, of course, encouraged much bigger government, and with it, much more information collection about the governed, as imperial states intruded deeper into the lives, not just of their home citizens, but of their colonial subjects, to demand more from them. Equally, the pressures of global war sometimes severed links between European governments and dependencies entirely, most obviously for defeated imperial states, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. The British Empire also suffered complete humiliation in the first phase of its war against Japan. In this and other inter-imperial contests, the violence of war tore administrative and economic fabrics apart, leaving the poorest and weakest in colonial societies chronically insecure. World War II's colonial famines in India, in Indonesia, and Vietnam, meanwhile registered the largest loss of civilian lives in modern colonialism, a cumulative total of more than 5 million people, either starved or afflicted by epidemic illnesses their bodies were too malnourished to resist. Yet even in the face of all that, empire was far from done. Its traces were evident in everything, from the constitutional plans of late colonial reformists to the developmental projects and human rights discourses promoted by supranational agencies, particularly UN agencies, and non-governmental organizations in the 1960s and later. The decolonizing world was still assigned junior status within this global political geography. Its elevation dependent on foreign-led modernization, capitalization, and technology transfer. Well, if all of that makes it harder to locate decolonization's start and end points, so does what might be called the violence problem. Here's an image I've used in several pieces of work I've done in the past. That's a special branch, or specifically a Malaya special branch search of a Chinese squatter encampment in colonial Malaya at the end of 1948, and you can see Gurkha soldiers in the background conducting a search there. It's quite possibly a staged image. I can't prove that to you one way or the other, I don't know. But whether or not it is staged, I think the fear and the insecurity on the faces of the two Chinese people at the front of the image is perfectly real. Well, thinking through that image, it might appear pretty obvious that decolonization was a violent business. That proposition looks self-evident, whether we focus on the big, the many wars of decolonization that have shaped the past century or so, or on the small, the workaday violence of exclusions, compulsions, indignities, and arrests that made discriminatory imperial rule tangible. But even if we accept that empires were violent places, does that actually take us very far? Plenty of non-imperial spaces and different political systems could be just as violent, often even more so. Some inflicted violence systematically, whether to remove opponents, to coerce compliance, or to hasten the social transformations that their governing ideologies demanded. Well, that, I suppose, takes us into the realm of ontology, of trying to establish what, if anything, set colonial violence apart and gave it a particular meaning. I'm going to dodge that question for now, because the challenge I'd like to tackle here is how we might configure violence as a dynamic of decolonization. Simply put, was it the motor, or was it just one of many different sorts of fuel? Did violence actually propel change, or merely alter its rate of advance, either slowing things down, usually through repressive crackdowns, or speeding things up, as, for example, through the adverse local and global reactions that those clampdowns precipitated? Well, whichever the case, the place of violence in decolonization is another indicator that shapes our understanding of how, when, and why empires ended. If, for example, we prioritize arguments over individual and social rights, from access to citizenship to improvements in basic welfare, the end of empires coheres around essentially socio-political struggles. If, on the other hand, we focus on the part played by organized violence in ending empire, we risk losing sight, I think, of the many non-violent debates and at least relatively non-violent spaces that were part of the decolonization story. This is not everywhere. But apart from its devastating human impact, where decolonization did occur, it always raised issues of legitimacy. Who, if anyone, could justify the use of violence against others? And that brings us to an even bigger question. What should a world without empire look like? Well, here's one answer, and here's another image that I will explain in a moment. After a Second World War left multiple empires intact, global conversations about how to free societies from colonialism sharpened. The languages, the registers of those conversations might differ, but their precept, I think, was always pretty much the same. Empires reified difference, and difference generated exploitation. Much of that conversation took place in print, over the airwaves, and some of it through art, through popular culture, through sport. But everywhere, anti-colonialism accrued power because it increasingly resonated, not just within empires, but across them, and among, in particular, communities aware that they were suffering fundamentally similar forms of discrimination. Colonialism was, in this sense, self-destructive. Local curbs on freedom to organize and speak out built new solidarities against the colonialists. And here's one of those outcomes. Here we see an Algerian nationalist medical team staffed very prominently by a young female supporter of the Front de Libération Nationale, the FLN, who is providing, in a sense, field medical care. This is classic humanitarian interventionism, but of the anti-colonialist kind. This is basic postnatal care. And of course, it is more than that. It is sending a message, as expressed in this piece of what is at the time Algerian nationalist propaganda. It is sending a message that such aid is for the people, pour le peuple. More than that, it's saying we ourselves are better able and, of course, more entitled to look after you than anybody else. That kind of action, I would suggest, is far more effective in mobilizing a groundswell of support than the preceding image of the gun and the arrest and the search is in preventing it. So the longer empires clung on, the less persuasive their arguments became for doing so. Anti-colonial claims, as that picture I would suggest indicates, were articulated in much more imaginative organizational forms. Third world conference cultures perhaps exemplified this evolution better than most things. The procession of meetings from the Manchester Pan-African Congress in late 1945 through perhaps the most famous of them all, the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955, to Accra's All-African Congress in a newly independent Ghana at the end of 1958, and on to the Tricontinental Conference in Havana in 1966 that brought the Latin American revolutionaries into the Afro-Asian struggle. Well, all of those lent a much sharper ideological edge to decolonization. And all of them were a form of what some have described as guerrilla diplomacy, something that gave substance to the idea that global politics was genuinely configured into three worlds, first, second, and third, in the 30 years or so from 1945. Cold War confrontation between capitalist West and communist East, well, that was an example of ideological rigidities really at variance with the revolutionary ferment and the popular demands for something new coming out of the decolonizing third world. And it was that ferment that ensured it was within territories fighting colonialism that, unfortunately, proxy conflicts would proliferate as what very quickly became a global Cold War actually a series of very hot war conflicts in Asia, in Africa, in Central America, were all fought out. Echoing this global Cold War, internationalist-minded anti-colonialists increasingly congregated in non-European cities after 1945. The decolonizing supporters, in other words, increasingly vented their support and their action from within what they described as a radical third world. By the early 1960s, Havana, Accra, Algiers, Cairo, Dar es Salaam, Hanoi, I could go on, but they all figured among several really dynamic hubs for this transnational activism against imperialism. Well, it all sounds pretty exciting, I suppose. Between the Cuban Revolution of early 1959 and that Algerian Front de Libération victory in 1962, this confluence between anti-imperialism and new leftist politics took ideological shape in this radical third worldism. And here you can see some of the kind of 1960s expressions of it, from Maoist China on the left to, well, back to Lusophone Africa, and this time the Frelimo movement in Mozambique on the right, intersected, of course, by the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and a socialist Jamaica that I will explain in a moment would be in the lead of arguments against structural dependence. Well, as those posters are trying to suggest, I suppose, decolonization as a global cause peaked somewhere between that Cuban Revolution in 1959 and 1974. Why so specific? Well, what I'm talking about here is often described as the long 1960s. It opened, as I've said, with the Cuban Revolution. It continued with successive African decolonizations, and it sustained its sort of radical impetus through transnational anti-colonial opposition to things like South African apartheid, the fate of Biafra during the Nigerian Civil War of 1967 to 70, the Palestinian cause, which would become increasingly prominent after the Six-Day War in 1967, and of course, perennial, I'm afraid, Vietnamese suffering throughout that 1960s long decade prior to the eventual defeat of the United States. But why 1974? Why such a specific ending? Well, the long 1960s, I'd suggest, came to an abrupt end with the failure of plans for the so-called New International Economic Order, the NIEO, which was launched at the end of 1973 and which hit the buffers in 1974. What set those long 60s years apart was the recognition among leading political actors in the decolonization story that political independence just was not enough. Back to self-determination. Well, yes, if it's to be meaningful for those new nations, for those decolonizing communities, it had to include the capacity to sustain human security, the ability to obtain the most basics in life, shelter, adequate food, the capacity to pass wealth from one generation to another. It had to encompass all of those things, which meant, in practice, enhanced social and economic rights. Newly independent countries of the global south, by contrast, found that their sovereignty was actually compromised by an economic order enshrined, as I've said earlier on, at Bretton Woods at the end of the Second World War, but hardened by Cold War rivalries, which condemned third world states to subservience to the rich world's economic demands. Well, you might be thinking, okay, this looks a bit like dependency theory warmed up. A return, in other words, to Kwame Nkrumah's warnings about neo-colonialism. Well, maybe, but I think it's still pretty persuasive. Working through the supranational forums of United Nations agencies, the preoccupation among those opposed to what they described as neo-colonial dependencies was that global financial and trading systems were so stacked against them that political decolonization was undermined. And that's exactly what Michael Manley is arguing about in that poster there. Well, that might suggest to you that the NIEO, the New International Economic Order, should have done better. Why didn't it? Why did it fail? Well, for one thing, it never represented a sustainable coalition. Its member states ranged from the socialist experimenters of West and East Africa to the ultra-capitalist oil producers of the Middle East, commonly united, of course, under the flag of OPEC. Even so, their combined call for a rebalancing of economic power between the industrial consumers of the global north and the commodity producers of the global south marked, I think, the biggest challenge of ideas to the capitalist way of doing trade since the Chinese Revolution of 1949. The oil crisis of 1973-74 was pivotal, hence that full stop to the long 1960s. It forced rich world countries to face uncomfortable truths about their reliance on vital commodities which were slipping from their control with decolonization. Ultimately, though, it did not reorder the world. So I get to my last theme and the close of the lecture, really. Mention of the new international economic order and the so-called oil shock brings me to the intersections between decolonization and globalization. For me, the really strange thing is that the contestations over the end of European colonial empires and the concomitant integration of global markets are not always set alongside each other, despite the evidence that colonialism's decline presented unprecedented opportunities for market access, transmigration, and new forms of cultural connection. In that sense, while it's tempting to say, well, decolonization surely is a disintegrative process, it's about things falling apart, globalization takes advantage of decolonization as an integrative process, welding the world together in a new way. Well, the United States, I suppose it's tempting and easy to say, led the construction of this post-World War II apparatus of international economic governance, of globalization, if you like, laying the foundations, of course, not just for their own hegemony and that of the United States dollar, but for, and I was saying earlier on that perhaps this lecture is now woefully out of date, but for a kind of free trade order that actually profited the United States and the capitalist rich world extremely well. It may have just been thrown away, so you might want to throw me out afterwards, but there we go. Alongside it, the acceleration of mass consumption from the 1950s and the subsequent rise of product boycotting as facets of ethically responsible citizenship turned a spotlight on inequalities between metropolitan consumers and colonial providers. I grew up in a household, I expect many of you did, where we never would eat South African citrus fruits, etc., etc. Boycotting was just a part of a kind of moral universe that perhaps enabled us to sleep a little bit easier, but actually didn't go a great deal beyond that, I'm embarrassed to say. Meanwhile, changing global trade rules and consumption patterns had very profound implications for the nations and communities emerging from empire. Decolonization's interactions, in other words, with capitalist globalization, or, if you're writing from the perspective of the communist Second World, with socialist internationalism, they all suggest that the idea of straightforward transfers of power between a single ruling empire and a dominant anti-colonial movement were never really total. The strands of economic connectivity, capital movement, communications links, and migratory flows, all integral to globalization, defied the boldness of non-alignment and other revolutionary visions of a post-colonial world. They're another reason, in other words, why the NIEO was set to fail. From patterns of foreign investment and the role of multinationals to the consequent prioritization of export-oriented production, the economic life of empires reflected forms of political economy that reinforced inequalities in the distribution of global power between North and South. Now, yes, decolonization had promised an end to all of that. But, as I said earlier, it failed to deliver as much economically and socially as it did politically or constitutionally. Sovereignty changes, in other words, were insufficient in and of themselves to stop capitalist globalization in its tracks. Anti-colonial modernizers, in a way, were themselves part of the problem because they pursued various strategies of development, infrastructure, educational provision, cultural and linguistic renewal, all things you might consider highly creditable, and all designed to make independence real, but all critically dependent on foreign money. In practice, then, foreign aid providers, technocratic expertise, and loan capital sustained forms of influence and obligation that jarred with those assertions of sovereignty. So to conclude, by discussing the nature of decolonization, I suppose I've been trying to show that while empires have ended, the world hasn't been fundamentally remade. If the socio-economic markers of 21st century colonialism may be registered in discrepancies of life expectancy, in rates of poverty, and differing life chances between rich world and poor, for those more interested in cultural legacies, the greater salience of colonialism lies in the casual racism of the everyday. And those marginalized by ethnicity, by religious affiliation, or by income from the narratives of rich world politics underline that I'm afraid the end of empires did not remake the world. Thank you.